Hello everybody and welcome to Alan History Nerd. In this video I am looking at some US politics, in particular party factions and the changing power and influence that exists within the parties. So this is part of A-level politics, it's part of the EdXL unit on US politics, and there's some really interesting stuff in it, and what I'm going to try and do is make sure we've got plenty of examples, particularly in relation to what has been going on recently with the 2020 election. So the spec says 5.2.2. The current conflicts and tendencies and the changing power and influence that exists within the parties, including Democrats, Liberals, Moderates and Conservatives, Republicans, Moderates, Social Conservatives and Fiscal Conservatives. So we're going to look at all those different groups. I'm also going to do a little bit on some of the stuff in terms of the national committees and the parties becoming a bit more centralised in terms of where the power is. It's important to note that both political parties in America are very, very broad churches. This means that they have people within them that have very, very differing views, and in fact you probably find almost as much disagreement within a party than you'll find between the two main parties. So don't be surprised if you hear two people from the same party, like two Democrats or two Republicans, arguing with each other, disagreeing on fundamental issues. But equally, don't be surprised if you see a member of one party expressing views on an issue which would be more typically associated with the other party. And often you'll have some Democrats in the House or the Senate will vote quite frequently along with the Republicans, and some Republicans in the House and the Senate who might vote quite frequently along with the Democrats. And you get bipartisan bills that will pass because they get support on both sides of the House. Now, American politics over recent years has become more partisan, which means that Republicans have been more likely to oppose anything suggested by Democrats, and the Democrats have been more likely to oppose anything suggested by Republicans, obviously most notably if suggested by Trump. And Trump really has brought about a kind of solidifying of partisan lines and a degree of distrust and dislike, I think I would say, between the two major parties. Now, Trump is difficult in all of this because he's not actually a typical Republican. He had previously been associated with the Democrats. In fact, there was a degree of friendship between him and the Clintons. Not that you'd have picked up on that in the 2016 election. He's particularly untypical of Republicans in terms of his views on large infrastructure projects. Normally, the idea of federal government getting involved in spending large amounts of money on infrastructure is something that Republicans would pull away from. They don't like big government. They don't like government doing big things and spending lots of money. He's also really untypical in terms of the ideas of intervention in the economy, and again all the promises we saw him make to areas like the Rust Belt, of areas like Pennsylvania and Wisconsin and Michigan in 2016. And his idea, whole idea of his of American first, this idea of supporting American jobs. His opposition to international treaties is not a typical Republican thing. His rejection or kind of going into conflict with some of the major international bodies. So some of the stuff he says about his split from WHO and his comments relating to NATO and the UN and things like that. So there are some bits in there where you kind of go, well, actually, not what we would expect from a Republican president. He's also very much opposed to the use of military force, and again we normally see Republicans as hawks, people who want a kind of very aggressive foreign policy, and as I speak there's been news over the last couple of days in terms of Trump wanting to peel back the number of troops in Afghanistan and Iraq. All seems to be part of him trying to create as much mess as possible before the 20th of January, but again kind of highlights that degree of his ideology. So we're going to come back to the Republicans, and the Republicans obviously have their factions, and Trump's made all that a bit more complicated. But we're going to have a look at the Democrats to start off with, and there's this particular branch that you'll definitely hear a lot from, which are the Liberals. or also referred to as the progressives, also seen as the radical wing of the Democrat Party. Now, they are seen as pushing for greater social justice, for greater welfare provision. Again, it's from the radical progressive wing, the liberals that you'll hear talk about universal healthcare, free healthcare for all, and things like that. They want higher taxes for the rich. They support trade unions. They, again, as we see some connections with Trump, they generally oppose military action by the US forces. They've captured attention really over recent years with particularly the demands such as defund the police following the murder of George Ford by a police officer. They're closely associated with social movements like Black Lives Matter. And the radical progressive wing of the Democrats has been key in opposing racism in institutions such as the police, and imposing the highly divisive policies and statements by Trump on race. On the progressive side of the Democrat Party, we've got key figures like Elizabeth Warren and Bernie Sanders, obviously, both of whom were involved in running for the Democrat candidacy going into the 2020 election. Now, the progressives and the radicals or the liberals, as you get, they attract a lot of media attention, and they attract a lot of attacks from the right-wing media in America, and in particular from Donald Trump himself. But it's worth noting that not all Democrats are part of this liberal progressive wing. So the Sanders, for example, probably the most high-profile figure from this side, he attempted to become the Democrat candidate in both 2016 and both 2020, and was defeated by Clinton and then was defeated by Joe Biden, both of whom were far, far more moderate than he is. To UK eyes and ears, the liberal, progressive or radical wing of the Democrat Party don't seem particularly radical, and they definitely don't seem to be what a lot of American media and American conservatives refer to them as being, which is socialists. And again, from our idea of socialism and what we've seen in our country and elsewhere, it's not socialism. But you have to remember, the eyes and ears of American audience are different. So some of the stuff that we would see as very mainstream, pretty moderate, and not particularly controversial, in America to some ears is seen as being fairly radical and out there. And this is one of the bits that can make watching and studying American politics a little bit tricky, because stuff that you think is normal and perfectly sensible to some American media outlets and commentators and politicians will be seen as really radical stuff. As I said, the Democrats have got more factions than just this kind of liberal progressive wing. So we've got the moderates, who are the centrist group. They tend to fill the middle ground. They're willing to compromise with Republicans, especially on issues such as government intervention in the economy, on things like reducing taxation, cutting taxes. They're normally willing to accept some forms of limitation on social issues such as abortion, on when it comes to civil liberties, because of the need for anti-terror laws. And it's worth, again, trying to, when you look at the American media and American coverage of American politics, and you'll see the protesters on both sides, and you'll see the pro-life, and then in the Democrat side, particularly from the progressive, you see a lot of the really strong advocates of pro-choice. Now, there is, and believe it, even in American politics, there is a centre ground somewhere in between the two, where there is an idea of choice, but with some degree of limit. But again, it doesn't tend to grab the media attention because it's not quite as tribal and quite as newsworthy in that kind of way. Now, we can argue that really the moderate faction is the dominant one in the Democrat Party. So whilst the progressives and the liberal side might get a bit more press, then actually in terms of Democrat voters and Democrat politicians, then the moderates are the biggest group. And moderate is probably the best description within the factions of the Democrat Party of Biden. Kamala Harris again probably leans is on the moderate side, but touching the progressive side, and maybe slightly more in the progressive, right? Definitely more progressive than Biden. The dominant group is the Democratic Leadership Council, and this was an organisation that pushed these ideas from 1985 through to about 2011, and it remains the mainstay of the Democrat Party. There is another group of the Democrats which are referred to as the Conservatives within the Democrat Party, often referred to as Blue Dogs. And these are, though they are a slowly kind of shrinking group, are Southern socially conservative Democrats. They tend to be conservative on ideas such as abortion and guns, but they disagree with Republicans on ideas like trade and tax. And we see examples of this in 2015. 47 Democrats, supported an extra screening of Iraqi and Syrian refugees. They are, as I said, a shrinking faction. Some commentators considered Hillary Clinton to be a blue dog. I mean, others would put her in that kind of moderate centrist group. So again, we can see that the Democrats are quite a broad church. What does the 2020 election tell us about the Democrats? Well, Biden, as I've said, a moderate Democrat, won. Well, unless you're still listening to Trump, who's claiming that he won, but overwhelmingly, as I speak here in November, we're making the assumption based on the results and everything that we've seen that Biden has won, and it looks like a resounding victory. Again, as I speak, we're at 5.9 million gap in the popular vote. Biden with 306 votes in the Electoral College, it appears. So that would suggest, really, we've had a moderate who's now done really, really well. So maybe the moderates are going to dominate. However, the progressive wing of the party played a key role of getting out voters, making sure that Biden did win. And this is particularly notable, for example, in the Black American vote, particularly in the cities, and there's a real notable contribution of a large number of black women in America, in particular, in terms of mobilizing the vote. And this is why, if you've been following the election maps and everything really closely, you'll notice that the victories in some of these cities is absolutely gigantic. Now, that doesn't suggest any degree of voter fraud. What it does suggest is a really amazing effort in terms of getting that voter group out, and as more and more data emerges from voting behaviour in 2020, it'd be really interesting to dig down into that. And young voters is another part of this. Again, tend to be more liberal and progressive, and an increase in voter turnout amongst the young has been really important for Biden as well. Now, it is easy to see that there will be demands for a say in the administration in return for this electoral victory, and so there will be progressives in the cabinet, and the progressive voice in the House will make itself heard. The split in the Democrats is still quite evident, however. There are some, such as Abigail Spanberger, who blamed the loss of some of her colleagues' seats, and the Democrats seem to have lost about 13 seats in the House. And she blamed their losses on the progressive wing of the party. She said that the progressive demands for defund the police and other, what she referred to as socialist policies, gave the Republicans the ability to portray all Democrats as radicals, and this cost moderate Democrats in more moderate and conservative districts across the US their seats. And so there's a call by some of the moderates to move away from some of these highly progressive demands, but some of the progressive politics is what was attracting a lot of people to the Democrat Party. We saw Biden win the primaries. It was a hard-fought victory, quite overwhelming in the end, but again, a hard-fought victory in the primaries. So the Democrat Party remains quite divided, and the new progressive liberal kind of push from a lot of Democrats is going to be resisted, and it's going to be interesting to see how that plays out. And when there isn't a Trump to rally against, it's whether that progressive wing will continue to progress. So the Republicans, well, they have a number of factions as well, and some of the factions are because they care about different things, and again this falls into our broad church. So we get the social conservatives, often referred to as the religious right. They're mainly Protestant, predominantly, again, or almost overtly the evangelical Christians. They take very strong lines on things like illegal immigration. They oppose gay rights, mostly gay marriage. They are anti-abortion, and there are, again, in terms of some of the religious right and evangelicals, they talk about life beginning at conception, and they want to get rid of abortion altogether. And then we start seeing the arguments in America getting really heated. They are less interested in economic policy. They are less interested in foreign affairs. And those ones, they tend to follow the Republican Party line. But what they care about is the socially conservative views of what they see as traditional Christian moral America. And therefore, the big one for them, particularly with Trump, was that he would pursue conservative policies and that he would get conservatives onto the Supreme Court benches, which he did, 3 of them. Now, they are increasingly dominant within the party. They are absolutely key to its heartlands in the Bible Belt, which goes around the middle of America. And if you've looked at the election maps, you'll notice that the sides, the coastlines are blue, and then most of the middle is red. And that's where the Republicans tend to dominate, and the social conservatives have a very big say because of this. How that plays in the cities on the coasts is another matter. You also get the fiscal conservatives. Now, these Republicans want smaller government. They want less regulation, economic regulation. They want free markets. They want the abolition of inheritance tax, referred to as a state tax in America. They also want to cut other taxes, notably on income, and most notably for the particularly well-off, that they refer to as the wealth generators. The Republicans' Freedom Caucus drives this agenda in Congress. It replaced the Tea Party, which eventually kind of splintered off. In 2017, it sent Trump a list of 228 regulations they wanted removing. This included numerous environmental regulations, but also ones on things like, government regulations doing crazy things, like demanding there was a degree of nutrition in school meals, and they don't want that kind of red tape standing in the way of commerce. They are key to the chances of the Republicans in the suburbs. They're key to the Republicans picking up the votes of small business owners, people who are self-employed, and high earners, of course. So and again, this is one of the very particular American things. Not people necessarily are high earners, but people who aspire to be high earners. And so that plays an important role in the Republican vote, but also in the makeup of Republicans in the Senate, as we've seen in the House, and often in terms of candidates they stick up for presidency. Now, also in the Republican Party, we see the moderates. Now, these are seemingly quite difficult to come across at the moment. They are less socially conservative. In some cases, they're quite socially liberal, but they're broadly conservative in economic policies. You'll see some who might start to describe themselves as things like libertarians, who will, like what the fiscal conservatives are saying in terms of free markets, but are not going to be quite so enthusiastic about the social conservatism. So some of them have shown support for things like gay rights, and also we've seen Republican government policy that try and aim to bring about greater social harmony. And a good example of this was the No Child Left Behind policies under George W. Bush. The most moderates in the Republican Party, and often again, if you're going to see Republicans winning seats and districts in places like California, then you can't have the kind of your hardline social conservatives, because they won't win in those states. But what you get is you'll get people who are referred to as rhinos, and that's not because rhinos are also rare. It's because they are Republican in name only. Rhino. And they are often called this, and some of them aren't actually Republican in name only, but they are more moderate than some of the more extreme end of the Republican Party, and Trump use it as a term of an insult. Now, we've got the Main Street Partnership is a caucus of the moderate Republicans in the House, and they are the group that we're going to see that is going to be most likely to compromise with moderate Democrats going forward. This is something that's become far, far less frequent in recent years. There is a chance with the Biden presidency that we might see this group kind of re-emerging once Trump goes. They seem to be quite scared of Trump at the moment. So they seem to be fairly strong in number, and one of the best examples is Suzanne Collins, but they're far less vocal than other members of the party, and so this seems to be at the moment a bit of a forgotten voice of American politics. And then we've got the Trumpistas, the Trump supporters, his base, as it's often referred to, and obviously he's made huge amounts of political appointments, and a lot of Republicans have seen, God, this guy's really popular. This is the way to go to kind of get power and influence, and possibly someone thinking of setting themselves up as the next one. Now he does use popularism. I mean, he has attracted support from far right groups such as the Proud Boys, who he's kind of name checked, and again then he denies knowing who they are, but in the rallies in support of him as he denies the election result, we've seen them out in force. Trump and his supporters, they tend to be anti-government, which is odd because he's president, but they are anti-masks. They seem to be anti-fair election results at the moment. They are anti the Washington elite. Again, a guy who's a billionaire born into huge amounts of money attacking the elite will seem odd, but that's the case. They are anti-media, or at least any media that disagrees with Trump. One of the interesting things during the fiasco since the election has been Trump either dumping praise or quite huge vitriol on things like Fox News when they dare to disagree with him, and obviously there's the more liberal, less conspiracy-based media, mainstream media, that he attacks and has been attacking all the way through. Trump and his supporters, they tend to share a lot of the socially conservative views on things like abortion, gay rights, gun laws, etc. He's promoted, again, a policy which might go back to the 19th century party, the Know Nothings, in terms of promoting protectionism rather than free trade. So free markets inside America, but protectionist against particularly, for example, China. And it's very, very anti-international cooperation, anti-international organisations. Again, we've seen not keen on using US troops. So it's got links with the other factions in that were already there in the Republican Party, but it is a slightly strange mix. So what next for the Republicans? Well, the current majority of Republican politicians seem particularly worried about upsetting Trump, and he seems quite upset already, especially with the runoff in the two vital Senate seats in Georgia about to come. It's a lot of the American media are saying, well, why are the Republicans not coming out and saying more firmly Trump has lost? Well, if Trump turns on the Republican Party, then that could be massively damaging for them going into the Georgia runoff. So they need to keep him on board because they need his electoral appeal to win both those seats. Now, Trump has undoubtedly, particularly internationalized, but I also think within America, damaged the reputation of the Republican Party with his refusal to accept defeat, wild accusations of voter fraud with random sackings of anybody who disagrees with him. However, it is quite clear that his base continue to support him. And the Republicans need his base to win elections, or feel they need his base to win elections at the moment. That may well be something that changes. Well, what will happen then after the 20th of January? We'll still wait to see whether Trump will be dragged out kicking and screaming or whether sense will prevail by then. It's all rather unclear. Will Trump run in 2024? I mean, I wouldn't bet against it. I definitely wouldn't bet against it at all at the moment. Would the Republicans choose him if he does run? Well, it would be difficult to see another Republican candidate beating him in the primaries. If he does or if he doesn't, what influence will he have from outside the White House over the next 4 years? Has he shifted the Republican Party permanently, or will things return to a kind of a pre-Trump normal? Again, time will tell on that one. Right, and the kind of final bit of the video, I want to look at some of the kind of the nuts and bolts of some of the stuff that's going on. So in terms of party organisation, you have got the national committees, the DNC and the RNC. They are headed by elected chairs. So you've got Tom Perez, who is in charge of the DNC. He's a moderate. You've got Ronna McDaniel, who is related to Mitt Romney, ironically enough, but is a Trump supporter. The DNC is made up of a chair, a vice chair, the chair and vice chair of each state, and plus the 200 members elected on a proportional basis, and so they're kind of almost creating a bit like in America with a kind of Senate style and a House style. The RNC has the chair of each state plus 2 further committee members. From each state, 1 male and 1 female, so 3 members from each state. So again, you can see in the RNC, you're going to get a more disproportionate representation of the smaller states. They tend to win a lot of the smaller states in the Electoral College. The job of the national committees is to raise money, hire staff, coordinate electoral strategy across the country, and organise the big national party convention that takes place before every presidential election. Everything else is done at state or local levels, and the parties have structures that go all the way down. They have them at state level, they have them at congressional district level, they have them at county level, city level, ward level, even precinct level. And traditionally, the parties were hugely decentralised things, and then the National Committee's job essentially was organise the party convention and not a lot else. Well, that has really changed. So parties in the US have become more top-down. Traditionally, political parties were, as I said, run by state and local organisation that just came together for presidential elections. Since the change in the finance laws in the 1970s and beyond, more money has gone to the national parties. The media, in particular TV, gave candidates an opportunity to speak to voters without having to do traditional rallies, and which state parties would organise, though Trump seems to have taken us back in time with that because he does love a rally. Opinion polls, not like who's going to win an election, but opinion polls on policy ideas or particular issues have reduced the need for candidates to go out and meet lots and lots of voters, and you get focus groups and opinion polls and things like that. Give them a lot of the data they need. We've also seen the growth of direct mail, and then also, again, another one, Trump's a great example, obviously the use of social media to talk directly to the people rather than having to go through party mechanisms. Now, the national parties have taken on an absolutely key role in running the parties in terms of they recruit, train all the local party candidates, state candidates. They give them legal advice, they give them media training, they give them financial advice and financial support. They do all the data analysis for them. So the parties have become more top-down and therefore getting a bit closer to how we see them in the UK. There are obviously still some fairly major changes. So we've got different factions, we've got some shift in party organisation. This is all really important in telling us about the location of power within the different parties. I hope that's been useful for you. If so, please hit the like. If you've got any questions or any comments, then please leave those. And if you haven't done already, then please subscribe to the channel. Loads and loads of politics videos on UK and US politics and political ideology. I'm looking to cover the entire A-level specification. And then there's also videos on a whole range of history topics as well. So if any of that interests you, check out the channel, check out the different playlists. Thank you very much for watching.